All right, so we cut our sink. We have it ready to be sanded out. So we got pretty close with it. We feel good about that. I always like to do the sink first, then I go to my edge. So I kind of get the hardest thing out of the way. And then now I'm gonna go and I'm gonna trim my edge. I like to trim everything down before I start sanding. So that way I've got the router, I'm using it all at once. I get done with the router, then I move on to sanding. Now, we've changed up our bit now because we're cutting the excess off of our edge. This bit is a flush cut bit, double fluted, okay, with a metal bearing. Now, I am very big on making sure that all bearings are lubed up constantly, okay? So every single time I go to start, I spray the bearing. Every single time I end, I spray the bearing. I do not router all the way down this edge and all the way down this edge without stopping. I go down maybe 3 or 4 feet, keeping an eye on this bearing, and then I stop, take it off, spray the bearing, and I rotate it around after I unplug it. I'll sit there and move the bearing around just to make sure that it's spinning freely, it's not froze up or anything like that. If your bearing freezes up, it has a dust plate on the top of this. That plate can blow, or the mounting screw that you have up here for that bearing can end up working its way out. So just a little side note on that. When you get new bits and you get them in the package and they come like this with a bearing on it and the mount screw on top, do not just automatically think that you can take that bit, put it in a router and start running it. That screw may only be hand tight. You want to make sure that you tighten that up, you make sure your bearing flows free, make sure everything is good before you start running it. Don't trust that the previous person before you took care of it. Just like when you leave a router, okay, you always want to make sure you spray the bearing so that the next person grabbing it knows that they have a fresh bearing, it's been checked. If it's not good, if you go at the end and you're all done for the day and you find that the bearing is not good, you go to spray it, it's not moving the way it needs to, replace the bearing. Because you may be the next one that grabs it and you forgot about it and it ends up blowing out on your top and it makes for a very bad day, okay? So when we go to use this, again, we want to make sure that we set the bearing where it's over a 1/2 inch because we're cutting a 1/2 inch worth of meat out. So I will actually even lower this a little bit more, okay, to make sure that I have about 3/4 of an inch from my plate to the top of my cutters. You don't want to go too much, all right, because you don't want to be having more out there than you actually need. That could lead to an injury, all right? So when I go to do this, again, make sure you have some eye protection, some hearing protection. If a mask helps, this doesn't throw as much dust as a sink, but it still throws dust, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I'm going to cut down this edge over here and then up cut this piece that's hanging over. So we're cutting away this excess meat to get everything as flat with this edge as we can. So that's also important to note that when you are working with a solid surface product, if you're doing a top that's, for example, 120 inches by 25 inches deep where it has to finish, you're going to want to add an 1/8 to both those measurements for anywhere that you're putting an edge, because you're going to have to set that edge in to have your counter hang over, because that way the adhesive has a place to lay, and then you're able to router that off and finish at your 120 inches by your 25 if that's what your depth is, okay? So again, just like before, I always spray the bearing, all right? I check where my cord is at. I want to make sure nothing's interfering with it. I put my router up. I will start my router with the bit away from the edge, let it gain full speed, and then bring it into it. Now I brought my router up and I stopped it. That's a bad habit. It's something out of habit that I get from working with it for a long time. The way you should truly do it is pull that away, turn your router off, let it stop all the way, and then bring it up. Sometimes when you're working with it so long, you forget some of the things, and that's one of the dangers that you can have, and that's when you end up getting hurt. So again, I go over, I spray my bearing. Now, when I come over here and I look at it, okay, you can see the difference between where we've taken the excess meat of the counter and adhesive off, and we're flat here. We ran it up this way. We have a little lip here that we'll be able to sand off, and we have it over here too where we'll be able to sand it, okay? So we'll show that basically what you then will do is you'll take this edge and you will flat sand it, okay? And then after you're done flat sanding it, on the top, you will add whatever profile that you're going to use, whether it's a round over or a beveled edge or anything like that. And on the bottom, typically what I like to do is I like to put an 1/8 inch round over, or at the very least break the edge, so if somebody's grabbing on that countertop, they don't cut themselves.